It's been years since that snowy Christmas, but the memory is as vivid as if it happened yesterday. At the time, I was living in a quiet town with my family. Life was simple, predictable even, but that winter brought a storm that would change everything. The snow had started falling heavily on Christmas Eve, cutting us off from the world outside. Roads were buried, and the only sound was the howling wind rattling against the windows. Trapped inside, I decided to make use of the time by rummaging through the attic for decorations we hadn't used in years. The attic was a space I rarely visited, a cold, dusty room where forgotten items sat in silent neglect. As I climbed the creaky stairs, flashlight in hand, I couldn't help but feel a chill unrelated to the winter air. The dim beam of light danced across old furniture, boxes stacked haphazardly, and cobwebs that clung stubbornly to the corners. After some time searching, I spotted something unusual. Among the faded boxes and torn ornaments was a neatly wrapped gift. It stood out immediately. The red bow was vibrant, and the paper, though slightly dusty, looked pristine compared to its surroundings. Curiosity got the better of me. I picked it up and examined it closely. No tag, no name, nothing to indicate who it belonged to or how it had ended up there. My heart raced slightly, not from fear, but from the strangeness of it all. Taking the box downstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about it wasn't right. But at that moment, I dismissed the thought, eager to see what was inside. Sitting in the living room, I placed the mysterious box on the coffee table. My family was busy in the other rooms, their laughter and chatter filling the house. I told myself it was just an old misplaced gift, perhaps from a previous Christmas that had been forgotten. Slowly, I untied the bow and peeled back the paper. Inside was a doll. Not just any doll, but an antique one, with delicate porcelain skin, faded clothing, and glassy eyes that seemed almost too lifelike. The smile painted on its face was meant to be sweet, but something about it felt wrong, like it was hiding a secret. I stared at it for a moment, uneasy but unsure why. Shaking off the feeling, I placed the doll on the table and stood to discard the wrapping paper. That's when the lights flickered. It was brief, just a few seconds of dimming and buzzing, but it was enough to make me pause. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like something moving upstairs. My heart skipped a beat. Grabbing a flashlight, I made my way back up to the attic. The room was in disarray. Boxes were overturned, decorations scattered, and a strange trail of disturbed dust led from where I'd found the gift to the attic door. I hurried back downstairs, shaken but trying to convince myself it was just the wind or my imagination. But when I reached the bottom of the stairs, I froze. The doll, which I'd left on the table, was now sitting on the first step of the staircase, its head tilted slightly as if watching me. I couldn't take my eyes off the doll. Its position on the staircase felt deliberate, its tilted head as if mocking me for my disbelief. My heart raced as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Perhaps someone in my family had moved it as a prank. It had to be that. "Who's messing with me?" I called out, trying to sound calm but failing miserably. No answer. The laughter and conversations I'd heard earlier were gone, replaced by an eerie silence. I picked up the doll, its glassy eyes catching the faint light, and returned it to the coffee table. It felt heavier in my hands than before, though I knew that was impossible. Setting it down carefully, I took a step back and stood there, watching it as if daring it to move again. Minutes passed, then an hour. The house remained silent except for the wind howling outside. I told myself I was being ridiculous and tried to distract myself by joining my family in the living room. They were now playing a board game, laughing as if nothing was wrong. "Everything okay?" my mother asked, noticing my pale face. "Yeah," I lied, forcing a smile. just tired. As the evening wore on, I tried to push the incident from my mind. But no matter how much I tried to focus on the warmth of my family and the festivities around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Later that night, long after everyone else had gone to bed, I sat alone in the dimly lit living room. My eyes kept drifting to the doll, which still sat on the coffee table. Its painted smile seemed more sinister in the soft glow of the Christmas tree lights. Then, just as I began to doze off, I heard it again, the rustling sound from upstairs. But this time, it was louder, accompanied by what sounded like faint, deliberate footsteps. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, moving from one end of the upstairs hallway to the other. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Clutching a flashlight, I forced myself to climb the stairs, my pulse pounding in my ears. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint moonlight filtering through the window at the far end. I swung the flashlight beam from side to side, illuminating the closed doors of the bedrooms. Everything seemed normal, but the air felt heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath. When I reached the attic door, I hesitated. The footsteps had stopped, but I could feel something on the other side, waiting. Slowly, I pushed the door open. The attic was a mess. Boxes were overturned, and decorations were strewn across the floor. But what caught my eye was the empty spot where I'd first found the gift box. The faint outline of dust around it was now smudged, as if something had crawled out. Then I felt it, a cold breath on the back of my neck. Whipping around, I shone the flashlight behind me, but there was nothing there. The sound of a giggle, faint and childlike, echoed through the attic, sending a jolt of terror through me. I bolted from the attic, slamming the door shut behind me. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, my heart sank. The doll was no longer on the coffee table. It was sitting on the bottom step of the staircase again, its head tilted even further this time. I spent the rest of the night in the kitchen, lights on, trying to stay awake. The doll didn't move again, but I could feel its presence, as if it were waiting for me to let my guard down. The morning light brought little relief. My family was bustling about the house, laughing and chatting, completely unaware of the terror I'd endured through the night. The doll was still sitting on the bottom step, its sinister smile unchanged, as if mocking me. I decided I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. During breakfast, I told my family about the noises, the attic, and the doll. At first, they thought I was joking. When they saw my pale face and trembling hands, their laughter faded, replaced by concern. "Maybe you're just overtired," my father suggested, trying to sound reassuring. "The storm has everyone a little on edge." But my mother looked worried. "Where did this doll even come from?" she asked, glancing uneasily at the staircase. "It was in the attic, in a gift box," I explained. "I don't know how it got there." Their expressions shifted from concern to disbelief. My father shook his head, muttering something about overactive imaginations. Frustrated, I decided I needed to take matters into my own hands. Grabbing a garbage bag, I wrapped the doll tightly and marched outside into the freezing snow. My plan was simple: get rid of it as far away from the house as possible. The wind bit at my face as I trudged through the snow to the trash bins at the edge of the property. With a sense of relief, I dumped the bag inside and slammed the lid shut. For the first time since the previous night, I felt a glimmer of hope that this nightmare might finally be over. I returned to the house, shaking off the cold and trying to reassure myself. But as I stepped inside, my stomach dropped. Sitting in the center of the living room, unwrapped and pristine, was the doll. Panic surged through me as I stared at the doll. My family, still skeptical of my claims, didn't seem to notice how it had returned. To them, it was just an old toy. But I knew better. This wasn't something I could simply throw away. Whatever was tied to this doll wasn't going to let go so easily. Desperate, I turned to the internet, searching for anything that might explain what was happening. Stories of cursed objects, haunted dolls, and malevolent spirits filled my screen. Most of them shared one unsettling theme: destroying the object often made things worse. I needed a plan, something decisive. I decided to burn it. If I couldn't get rid of it by conventional means, fire would have to be the answer. That evening, I built a small fire pit in the backyard. The flames crackled against the cold air as I carried the doll outside. My family watched from the windows, their faces a mix of curiosity and worry. With trembling hands, I placed the doll into the fire and stepped back. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the flames flickered unnaturally, casting long, twisting shadows across the yard. The doll's painted eyes seemed to glow, and a faint, high-pitched sound, almost like laughter, echoed through the night. The fire eventually consumed the doll, leaving behind only ashes. But as I stood there, staring at the remains, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly gone. The air felt heavier, as if something unseen lingered, watching. I returned to the house, exhausted and shaken, hoping I had put an end to whatever curse had taken hold of us. It's been years since that Christmas night, but the memory still lingers, as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. At the time, I was living in the city, far from my family. That year, I'd been invited by an old friend to spend Christmas at his house in a quiet, remote neighborhood. It was supposed to be a warm, peaceful evening, a welcome change from my usual solitude during the holidays. The drive out to his neighborhood was uneventful at first. The streets grew darker and quieter the further I went, and the faint hum of my car engine was the only sound breaking the stillness. Most of the houses were dark, their residents likely gathered elsewhere celebrating. The few that had decorations were modestly lit, nothing out of the ordinary. That was until I turned onto his street and saw it. A house so brilliantly illuminated that it seemed to outshine the stars themselves. Every inch of it was covered in colorful, flashing lights. Roof, windows, trees, and even the driveway sparkled in rhythmic patterns. At first, I thought it was overdone but festive. Yet, something about it felt off. I slowed my car, trying to get a better look. The lights flickered in strange sequences, almost like they were trying to communicate something. I chuckled nervously, shaking off the thought, and drove past, telling myself it was just someone's idea of holiday spirit taken to an extreme. But as I neared my friend's house, the image of that glowing monstrosity stayed with me, a gnawing unease settling in my chest. After parking at my friend's house, I couldn't resist taking another look at the glowing house. Something about it drew me in, a strange mix of curiosity and dread. The lights continued to flash, their patterns growing more erratic as if aware of my gaze. "I'll just take a quick look," I told myself, stepping back into the cold night air. My friend wasn't expecting me for another 15 minutes, so I had time. The house seemed to grow brighter as I approached, the colors reflecting off the snow and casting strange shadows around me. As I got closer, I realized that the lights weren't random. They were forming words. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the closer I got, the clearer the message became: enter. My stomach twisted in discomfort, but my feet kept moving. I stopped at the base of the driveway, debating whether to go further. That's when the door creaked open on its own. The interior was pitch black, a stark contrast to the dazzling lights outside. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. The air felt colder now, almost biting. My instincts screamed at me to turn around and leave, but I hesitated. It wasn't just curiosity holding me there, it was something else, an invisible force that seemed to pull me closer. I took one step onto the porch, then another. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the lights. I reached for the doorframe, peering into the darkness beyond. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath came out in shallow puffs. And then I heard it, a soft whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from inside. It said my name. The sound of my name spoken in that whisper sent a jolt through my body. I froze, unsure if I had imagined it. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but something stronger, a mix of fear and compulsion, kept me rooted in place. Against my better judgment, I took a step inside. The interior of the house was cold, much colder than the night outside. My breath misted in the dim light, and the air was heavy, almost oppressive. The contrast between the vibrant exterior and the barren interior was unsettling. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse and old, and the faint smell of dust and mildew lingered in the air. I moved cautiously, my footsteps echoing against the hardwood floor. The darkness seemed to press in around me, and my only source of light came from the faint glow seeping through the windows. As I ventured deeper, the whispering started again, faint and unintelligible at first, but growing louder with each step. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to mask the tremor in my voice. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. I scanned the room, but there was nothing, no one. Just the faint hum of the Christmas lights outside. As I stepped into what looked like the living room, I noticed something odd, a single chair placed in the center of the room. It faced an old, dusty mirror that hung crooked on the wall. The chair seemed out of place, as if it had been left there for a reason. I felt a chill run down my spine, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement in the reflection. But when I turned to look, the room was empty. I took a step closer to the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached out to straighten it, the chair creaked softly, as if someone had just sat down. I froze, my hand hovering inches from the mirror. The creak of the chair echoed in the silent room, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Slowly, I turned back to the chair, expecting to see something. But it was empty. The whispers returned, louder now, coming from every direction. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were voices, layered and overlapping, speaking in a language I didn't understand. My chest tightened, and panic clawed at the edges of my mind. I stumbled back toward the doorway, but before I could reach it, the lights outside flickered violently. The colors reflected off the walls, casting distorted shadows that seemed to move on their own. One shadow, darker and more defined than the others, began to take shape, growing taller and more distinct. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shadow loomed closer, and for a moment, it felt like the entire room was closing in around me. The voices grew deafening, a cacophony of anger and despair. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I turned and bolted toward the front door. The whispers turned into a single, guttural voice that roared behind me. "You shouldn't have come." The door, which had been ajar when I entered, slammed shut as I reached it. I threw myself against it, twisting the knob frantically. It wouldn't budge. My heart was hammering so loudly that I could barely think. The air grew colder, and I felt something brush against my shoulder, light but unmistakable. Finally, with one desperate shove, the door flew open, and I stumbled out into the freezing night. The whispers stopped abruptly, and the oppressive weight lifted. I didn't look back. I ran to my car, jumped inside, and drove straight to my friend's house without stopping. By the time I reached my friend's house, my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely turn off the ignition. The warmth of the house when he opened the door was a stark contrast to the icy terror I had just fled from, but it did little to calm my nerves. "You all right? You look like you've seen a ghost," he said with a laugh, but his smile faded when he saw my face. I saw something," I stammered. My voice was barely above a whisper as I stepped inside. He ushered me to sit down, offering me a glass of water. My mind raced as I tried to form the words to explain what had happened. I described the house, the lights, the whispers, the shadow. Every detail spilled out of me like a flood. My friend listened, his expression shifting from concern to confusion. "What house?" he asked finally, his brow furrowed. "The one just down the road from here, the one lit up with all the Christmas lights," I said, frustrated by his reaction. He shook his head. "There's no house like that here. Most of the houses on that street have been empty for years. No one decorates them." I stared at him, waiting for him to tell me he was joking. But his expression remained serious, and a cold knot of fear formed in my chest. "That's impossible," I said. "I saw it. I went inside." My friend's face darkened. He leaned in closer. "If you're not messing with me, you need to stay away from that place. There are stories about an old house in this neighborhood. People say it burned down decades ago, but sometimes people still see it. They say it only shows up on certain nights, but whatever you saw, it wasn't real. At least, not in the way you think." I barely slept that night. The warm, familiar surroundings of my friend's house did little to ease the unease that clung to me like a shadow. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, even though I knew it was impossible. The next morning, I left early, making excuses about needing to get home. My friend didn't press me, though I could see the worry in his eyes. As I drove back to the city, I couldn't bring myself to look in the rearview mirror for fear of what I might see. That Christmas left a scar on me. To this day, I refuse to spend the holidays in remote places. I avoid quiet neighborhoods, and if I ever see a house decked out in extravagant lights, I look the other way. I don't know what I encountered that night, whether it was a ghost, a memory, or something else entirely. But I do know one thing: it wanted me to stay. And I have no doubt that if I had, I would never have left. It's been years since that Christmas Eve, but the memory still sends a chill down my spine. At the time, I had just moved into a quaint little house on the outskirts of a small town. I'd always enjoyed my own company, so spending Christmas alone didn't seem odd to me. The house was cozy, the kind of place you imagine curling up in with a good book while snow falls gently outside. That year, I decided to go all out with the decorations. Strings of lights adorned the porch and the garden, casting a warm glow on the fresh snow. I'd even set up a small nativity scene in the yard, something I hadn't done since childhood. The atmosphere was idyllic, and I was determined to enjoy a peaceful evening. As the snow continued to fall, I sat by the window with a cup of cocoa, admiring the lights outside. That's when I noticed it, a shadow moving among the trees at the edge of the yard. At first, I thought it might be an animal, perhaps a deer or a fox. But the shadow was too tall, too human-like. I shook my head, telling myself it was just a trick of the light. After all, the snow and the decorations could easily create strange reflections. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to refocus on my book, but my eyes kept drifting back to the window. The shadow was gone, or so I thought. As the clock struck 9, I decided to ignore my unease and go about my evening. It was just my imagination, I told myself. What could possibly go wrong on such a peaceful night? The peace didn't last long. As the night grew quieter, I began to hear faint sounds outside, soft, rhythmic crunching, like footsteps in the snow. I froze, straining to listen. The sound would stop for a moment, then resume, coming from different directions around the house. My heart began to race. It's probably just the wind, I whispered to myself, though I knew it wasn't. The pattern was too deliberate, too measured. I crept to the window, careful not to make a sound. Peering out, I saw nothing but the softly illuminated yard and the dark line of trees beyond. The snow was falling steadily now, its pristine surface undisturbed. But the sound persisted, faint but undeniable. Then came the knock. 3 soft, deliberate raps on the front door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I hadn't seen anyone approach the house. For a moment, I debated ignoring it, but the knocking came again, more insistent this time. Gathering my courage, I approached the door. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. No response. I looked through the peephole, expecting to see nothing. Instead, I saw a figure standing just beyond the porch lights, shrouded in shadows. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just stood there, holding something that glinted faintly in the light. Panic surged through me, and I stepped back from the door. Turning off the lights, I retreated to the safety of the living room, hoping that whoever or whatever it was would go away. But deep down, I knew the night was far from over. I sat in the dark living room, the only light coming from the faint glow of the Christmas tree. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Every sound seemed amplified. The creak of the floorboards as I shifted my weight, the soft hum of the heater, and most of all, the faint crunch of snow outside. The figure hadn't moved. At least, not as far as I could tell. The occasional glint from whatever they were holding kept catching my eye through the window. I tried to convince myself that it could just be a prank, some neighborhood kid messing around. But who would do that on a freezing Christmas night in the middle of nowhere? Minutes felt like hours as I sat there, frozen with indecision. I thought about calling someone, but who? I didn't know my neighbors well, and the idea of explaining this to the police seemed ridiculous. What would I even say? There's a shadowy figure standing outside my house holding something shiny. It sounded absurd. Just as I was gathering the courage to peek out the window again, the knocking resumed, louder this time. Bam, bam, bam. It wasn't just a knock now. It was a demand. I clutched the phone in my hand, my fingers hovering over the emergency number. But before I could dial, the knocking stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear. There was nothing at first, just the oppressive silence of the house. Then, faintly, I heard footsteps. They were moving away from the door, crunching through the snow. I crept to the window and pulled the curtain back just enough to peek out. The figure was retreating into the darkness of the trees, their silhouette barely visible in the dim light. But the fear didn't leave me. It felt like they weren't gone for good, just biding their time. I must have dozed off at some point, exhaustion overriding my terror. When I woke up, the first rays of sunlight were streaming through the curtains. The sight should have been comforting, but the events of the night before weighed heavily on me. I hesitated before opening the door, half expecting the figure to be standing there. But the porch was empty. The snow sparkled under the morning sun, its surface disturbed only by a trail of footprints. They circled the house multiple times, as if whoever it was had been watching me from every angle. My stomach turned as I followed the tracks to the front door, where they stopped abruptly. There, sitting neatly in the snow, was a small box wrapped in shiny red paper and tied with a silver bow. Beside it was an envelope, the edges slightly damp from the frost. I stared at the items, a sinking feeling growing in my chest. I knew I shouldn't touch them, but my curiosity got the better of me. I picked up the envelope first, my fingers trembling as I opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message written in elegant, looping handwriting. Voltaire el proximo anno. My blood ran cold. I dropped the letter as if it had burned me and turned my attention to the box. Against my better judgment, I tore the wrapping paper away. Inside was a small, intricately carved ornament, a figure of a man holding a lantern, his face obscured by a hood. I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The ornament was eerily similar to the figure I'd seen outside. I shoved the box back into the snow and slammed the door behind me, locking it as if that could keep whatever it was away. But deep down, I knew the locks wouldn't stop it. The rest of that Christmas day passed in a haze. My appetite was gone, my hands wouldn't stop trembling, and every creak of the house made me flinch. I avoided the windows, terrified of what I might see if I dared to look outside. The gift box and its contents remained in the snow, untouched. I thought about leaving, packing my things and driving away, but where would I go? It was Christmas, and the roads were slick with ice. The nearest town was miles away, and I doubted I had the courage to face the cold and the unknown dangers of the night again. Instead, I stayed inside, burying myself in blankets and waiting for nightfall with a dread I couldn't shake. I kept rereading the message in the letter. Voltaire el proximo anno. The words were simple, but their implications were horrifying. The sun began to set, and I couldn't help but feel like the house was holding its breath along with me. I checked every lock, turned on every light, and stayed in the living room where I had a clear view of the front door. Hours passed, and nothing happened. No footsteps, no knocking, no shadowy figures. When the clock struck midnight, I let out a shaky breath, realizing I'd been holding it for far too long. I wanted to believe it was over, that the figure was gone and I was safe. But even as I sat there, exhausted and on edge, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I moved out of that house a week later. I didn't even wait for New Year's. I left most of my belongings behind, unable to face the idea of returning to the porch or seeing that cursed gift again. 4 years, I refused to talk about that Christmas Eve. When friends asked why I avoided the holidays or declined invitations to secluded cabins, I just smiled and changed the subject. How could I explain something that sounded so absurd, so impossible? But the truth lingered, gnawing at me every December. Every time I saw Christmas lights or heard carolers singing, I was transported back to that night. The sound of snow crunching underfoot would send my heart racing, and I avoided looking at red-wrapped gifts as if they might come alive. I never celebrated Christmas in isolation again. Even now, I make sure to spend the holidays surrounded by people, in places far from any forest or desolate countryside. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I think about that letter and its haunting promise. Voltaire el proximo anno. I wonder if the figure has moved on to someone else, some other solitary soul in a quiet house on Christmas Eve. I pray it has. But a part of me fears that one day I'll hear those footsteps again, and I won't be so lucky to escape. To hear more stories like this, subscribe and leave a like.